I'm one of the graduate assistants, and then we also have our other student workers. So this is, I don't know,
I'm Leilani.
and then we have Millie, our university assistant. We have a new student worker,
Sophia.
I'm Bella. Okay, so thank you for joining us today. Survey Patel joined CCSU. Oh, my bad. And Dr. Mahoney is joining us on Zoom. As the Director of Student Disability Services in June 2021 with an undergraduate degree from the University of Connecticut and a graduate degree in Student Development and Higher Education from CCSU. Prior to starting at CCSU, Survey worked at Bay Path University as the Executive Director of Academic Support Services, including accessibility services and tutoring-based programs. Survey brings a unique blend of experiences that focus on disability and academic support and has been working in the field for over 10 years. She's passionate about education and ensuring access and equity to all students.
Thank you. I appreciate, well, first of all, thank you guys for having me, and I appreciate everyone's time. I know that it's not always possible to make time for some of these things, but I think that they're all very important. So I appreciate the platform to be able to share and talk to you guys and to kind of, I have a presentation, so I want to give you an overview of essentially what our office does high level, but I would also, love to hear questions and things from all of you. So if there's anything at any point, if you have a question, you can definitely stop me. I will share my screen, so just give me 1 second. Let me know. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. You don't see a dog, right? You see my presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. So essentially, hold on 1 second. So a little bit about our office. Our office is located in Willard de Loretto Hall on the Willard side. So we do have an office space on the second floor along with some of the other areas of support. So we are centrally located, I want to say, with all of the other areas that provide support to students, career services being one of them, registrar, financial aid. We're there, the learning center, the writing center. So it's nice because one of the things that, the university does very well is have all of these services in one area. So that way, students don't really have to go far. We do have extended hours. So we are open Monday through Friday. Monday through Thursday, we're open 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Because we do support, we have a testing center that we support students who take tests, and I will go over that a little bit in a few minutes, but we are open till 8 p.m. So we try to provide evening support to students who may come to our office and have questions and that sort of thing. We are also open all year round. So we are open during winter break and summer break as well. So, and on Fridays, we're open 8 to 5. So during winter break and summer break, we are open 8 to 5 because we don't operate our testing center. On Fridays, we also close at 5, but we do have extended hours, I would say, during the semester to help support students. So what our office does, I wanted to read you our mission actually before I go into the specifics of what our office does. But Student Disability Services is committed to providing an accessible campus environment for all students governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, specifically Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as well. So thinking about the date, 1990, I guess maybe if you ask people of my age, doesn't seem that long ago. When it comes to civil rights movements and, providing equity and access to services, 1990 wasn't that long ago. So disability services and support for students who have any type of underlying medical condition or impairment, I would say is definitely newer than some of our other civil rights movements. But in a short period of time, we've made a lot of headway, and I hope that that continues because there is a lot that we can do as individuals, as a community, in order to provide support and access to students. The law provides that any person with a mental or physical impairment that limits one or more major life activities shall be considered for and entitled to accommodations. And I will go over the accommodation process in just a few minutes. We as a university are committed to providing necessary and reasonable modifications to programs, services, facilities in order to provide accommodations to students. So we are very invested in ensuring that students have access to anything on campus that they would need support and access to. The types of accommodations that our office provides. So we have a number of categories in which we provide accommodations. The first category, and one of the biggest ones, is academic accommodations. So what is an academic accommodation? An academic accommodation essentially is some type of support that assists students essentially with their academics. So it could be in the classroom or outside of the classroom. Common accommodations are things like note-taking support and services. So maybe you're a student who has some type of underlying medical condition and it impacts your ability to take notes. Our office would work with you to ensure that you still were able to successfully have access to class notes. Testing accommodations. I mentioned that we have a testing center here in our office that we operate till 8 p.m. We do have a number of students who are approved for additional time and other testing related accommodations. We operate a testing center on campus because we want to support our instructors as well, and to ensure that, you know, if a student does require extra time on test, they have a space that they can come to and take that test. Deadline extensions on assignments are sometimes reasonable for students. Taking breaks during classes can be reasonable. There is not I would say, a comprehensive list of accommodations that we just that are a part of our office. The process in which we evaluate accommodations is individual based on each student. And so not everyone with the same diagnosis may have the same types of accommodations. Ultimately, what we're looking to do is we're looking to understand what that student's underlying medical condition is. And the medical condition can vary based on student. It can be mental health, it could be physical health, it could be psychiatric, it could be any type of learning disability, ADHD. So the conditions themselves can vary. And then the accommodations that are associated with those conditions can also vary. And that all depends essentially on how a specific condition impacts the individual. So some students might have diagnoses that don't impact them so severely, and others might have them and it impacts, you know, them severely to a point, or maybe even moderately. And so based on how a student's diagnosis impacts their daily activities, how it impacts their academics, is how we come to a rationalization as to which accommodations that they would benefit from and they would be reasonably qualified for. In addition to academic accommodations, we also provide accommodations to any campus activity. So any program, any athletic program, any sport, like club, organization, intramurals. It just depends on what it is that you as a student are looking to participate in, and what accommodation you may need to help you participate in that activity. You would want to reach out to our office. Another accommodation or category of accommodations we provide, we call them Title IX accommodations, but essentially what they are their support for students who are either pregnant, or they're parenting, or they're planning, and they are being impacted in some capacity because of that. Our office would work with these students specifically to provide them accommodations. They don't typically fall under the category of the ADA. They fall under Title IX, which is a different law, but we still, as an office, support those students and provide accommodations for those students. The other last category, or bulk category, I guess I would say, is housing accommodations. We have a number of students on campus that do qualify for various housing accommodations. Some examples of housing accommodations are medical single spaces on campus. So if you are a resident and you, for whatever reason, due to your underlying medical condition, require a single occupancy space, so a individual room to yourself, you would work with our office to ensure you had access to that. One thing that we get a lot of questions on is that are all the medical singles in one facility or in one hall? Are they, tagged differently or anything like that? And the answer to that is no. So the medical singles and or any housing accommodations are across campus in all of our residence halls. There's also no indicator in which that any other student or faculty or staff would be able to know that you as a student have a medical single. To the outside person, it just looks like you're in a single space, which we also have on campus. So as a student, you can elect for a single occupancy space without it being a medical accommodation. But that does come up a lot, that, you know, students do have access to having medical singles in any of our halls. All of the housing accommodations, specifically the medical singles, are based on availability. And so when it comes to housing accommodations, there are certain timelines and guidelines in which we want students to follow, because again, it's based on availability. So if a student comes to our office and they're looking for a medical single and there are no spaces on campus, that student essentially wouldn't be able to get into a room until a space became available for them. So it is based on availability. Other accommodations that fall under housing are dietary accommodations, so things that impact, you know, food, meal plans, support animals, which I will go over in a minute, but emotional support animals, as well as service animals. Any installed devices, and so many times students who might have require something specific, for example, a bed shaker. That's a common accommodation for students who are on campus who are hearing impaired. If they are unable to hear a fire alarm, they wouldn't be able to, you know, necessarily evacuate during an emergency, especially in the middle of the night. And so we do install things like bed shakers, that are connected to essentially any emergency alarm. If the alarm went off, the bed would automatically shake, awakening the student. So we have devices like that many of our students use. Air conditioning is a big accommodation for many students who may need it. Especially in the summertime, you know, asthma is something that comes up often. Lucky for us as an institution, we do have many halls that are air conditioned naturally, so we don't really have too many concerns making sure that students get into an air conditioned space. Ground floor housing, so anyone who might potentially need to stay on a ground level. Bathrooms are important too for many of our students. So if there is any adjustment or modifications to bathrooms, you would work with our office for that as well. We also have true handicap accessible spaces on campus in all of our residence halls. So that's important to remember and understand. So if you are a student who needs a handicap accessible bathroom, handicap accessible bedroom, we do have spaces on campus, and we would work with students to ensure that they have access to those spaces and then they feel comfortable. Before I move forward, does anyone have any questions?
I have one. What is typically the timeline in which a student has to come to your office for these accommodations? Is it like a certain point in time in the semester they have to be before, or is it as needs arise for the student?
Actually, I'm going to go over that. So I'm going to table that question for just like 2 slides, if that's okay. Other questions though? And that's a really good question that you've asked, so thank you.
How about the support animals? Do they have single rooms usually, or a specific building?
Good question. I'm actually going to go, oops, I went wrong. I'm actually going to go over that just right now. So we do get a lot of questions that come up for support animals, and these are for faculty ask a lot of questions, but students as well. And I think it's really important for us as a university and a community to understand, I think, the difference in support animals. So we have 2 types of support animals. We have emotional support animals and then service animals. And there is a big difference between the 2. So service animals essentially they're specifically trained to perform a task to the person that they're assisting. So it could be somebody who, visually impaired individual, somebody who may be hearing impaired. It could be somebody who has a chronic medical condition. So it just depends on the condition itself, again, can vary. But a service animal's role is that they are trained to provide a task or to do a task. So that could be, helping navigate if somebody is visually impaired. It could be alerting somebody who's hearing impaired. It could be pulling a wheelchair for an individual. It could be alerting someone who might have like a seizure disorder or a heart condition that, that something is going to be happening and that they need to either lay down or they need to take their medication. So service animals are specifically trained. Typically, service animals are usually dogs or small horses or ponies. So they do, that is the category for the most part. There is not a formal restriction on what type of animal a service animal has to be, but typically what we find is that they're usually dogs or any type of small pony or horse. Emotional support animals, on the other hand, could be any animal. They are not specifically trained at all, but what they do is that their presence alone provides emotional support to the individual that owns them. And so it is a big difference because the emotional support animal doesn't typically perform any tasks. Emotional support animals also are restricted. When we approve an emotional support animal through our office, we approve them as a housing accommodation, and that animal must maintain or must stay in that student's residence hall, so that space. Typically, if you have an emotional support animal, you don't necessarily need a single space. So those are two different accommodations. So emotional support animals can also vary. So they can be cats, they can be dogs, they can be rabbits, they can be birds, they can be fish, they can be hamsters, gerbils, bearded dragon. So it just depends on the individual. We've seen a number of emotional support animals. And again, their presence alone provides support to the individual who's caring for them. They do have to stay within the residence hall. Depending on what the animal is, they can be housed with another student as long as the student is comfortable having an animal in their shared space. So they don't always necessarily need a single space. We have a number of students on campus who have emotional support animals who have roommates as well. Service animals there is a difference with service animals. Our students with service animals do not legally need to register with our office. So they don't need to alert our office that they have a service animal. Service animals are legally permitted in all public areas. So on campus, they could go to any of the public spaces. Emotional support animals cannot. Again, service animals can, and because the reason behind this is because they are trained to perform some type of task. So they need to maintain connection with whoever their owner is in the event that that owner has some type of medical emergency that their animal needs to assist them with. It is important to understand also that any student on campus who has a service animal can be asked 2 questions. They can be asked if their animal is required because of a disability, and they would have to answer like yes or no. And then they may also be asked by any professional what task that animal is trained to perform. Now, what they don't necessarily need to do is then have the animal perform the task, but anyone can legally ask a student with a service animal, those 2 questions. So that's also important. A lot of times for our faculty who might, question if a student brings an animal, why is that animal in class? Is it really a service animal or is it an emotional support animal? So those are the distinctions between service and emotional support animals. Does anyone have any questions there? Okay, very good. Actually did want to mention, hold on. One thing about emotional support animals that's important is that they do have to come through our office. All housing accommodations do need to be renewed on a yearly basis. So that's really important. And I'm going to go through and talk to you guys about the registration process. So this was the question that was brought up earlier, when should you initiate this process? Typically, we ask students to contact our office as soon as possible. So first year incoming students, the summer of your first semester, it would be a great time to contact our office. The process does require a couple of steps. The first step is to complete an intake application or form. We have one for academic accommodations and one for housing. As a student, you may need to do either one or the other or both, depending on what you're requesting. The registration process in itself is also located on our website, or you can come to our office and we can provide you written copies of everything. Once you complete the intake form, you do have to submit disability verifying documentation. So what does that mean? What our office is looking for is some type of documentation that verifies your underlying diagnosis. We do have requirements online as to what we specifically look for, and it does change. So if you are a student with a learning disability, we do look for an evaluation that was typically done in high school. If you're a student with a chronic medical, psychiatric, or mental health condition, we have a disability verification form that your medical provider could fill out. So whatever the documentation is, it can vary, again, based on your condition, but we do look for documentation to ensure that we can verify what your underlying diagnosis is. There are times when medical documentation may not be necessary, and usually that's if whatever the condition is an observed condition. So if we can physically see that you have a specific condition, you don't necessarily then need to provide medical documentation, but a lot of the conditions that our students are diagnosed with are either invisible or that they require some type of documentation to confirm. Once we have your intake form and the documentation and we have the opportunity to review it, we do schedule an intake meeting. The intake meeting is typically 45 minutes to an hour, but we go through the actual process of reviewing your medical documentation and then understanding and discussing with each individual student what accommodations might be the best fit for them. And so that is really important, and that process can, again, take about an hour to 45 minutes. Typically for first-year students, we do encourage students to reach out to us as soon as possible. Again, there is no deadline necessarily for academic accommodations, but accommodations do go into effect in real time. So if you reached out today, let's just say, and we put accommodations into place today, then they would start today. They wouldn't have started at the beginning of the semester. So that's why it's really important that you contact us before the semester begins. One thing that is also important is that this is a student-driven process. So what that means is that once you go through the process and we approve accommodations for you, we then will issue what we call a letter of accommodation. The letter of accommodation is emailed to your professors. On the letter, it indicates the classes that you're taking and then the accommodations in which you're approved for. We do not disclose disability or diagnosis to anyone outside our office, and that's very important. So legally, we don't disclose disability, and legally, your professors are not going to ask any specific student what their underlying diagnosis is. What they can do and would do, many of them, is talk about the accommodations themselves and what the best practices are going to be for that class, how the implementation and the utilization of the accommodation might be. So it's really important because it's really important to understand that, one, you don't have to disclose why you have an accommodation, but it's important that you will need to have conversations with your professors about your accommodation plan. One of the biggest differences from high school to college level accommodations is that it's that student-driven process. So once the letter gets issued to professors, it is the student's responsibility to individually request accommodations from their professor that are on that list. Some things students can manage on their own, but other things, for example, like extra time on tests, it is the student's responsibility to reach out to their professor and to ensure the coordination of that accommodation. So what won't happen and what is different than high school is that your professor is not going to be reading your accommodation letter and then just gives you the accommodations. Students do have to request them. And I think that the most important reason why is because it's a student's choice whether they'd like to use their accommodations. All of the accommodations in an accommodation plan are case by case and specific to each class. So it's always a student's right to not use accommodations if they feel that they don't need them for any given class, any given assignment or test. Just depends on what the accommodations are. For housing, we do ask, so for housing, also, again, it's because it's based on availability, we ask that students submit their documentation to us in the summertime if they're looking for fall accommodations, for fall housing. If they're already approved for accommodations, we do have a yearly renewal process in which students have to submit new documentation to us before, usually we request before the spring semester ends, so that way we can allocate enough space on campus for whatever their needs are. So if students do not submit their renewals within a specific period of time, again, it goes based on availability. So if we don't have space or they're looking for an accommodation that we can't make available, they would have to wait until it becomes available. Questions there? So I do have a couple of best practices that I just wanted to share for students and then for faculty as well. One of them I kind of mentioned, it's, ensuring that you contact our office as soon as possible, especially prior to the beginning of the semester. This way we can put your accommodation plan in place and you'll be ready to go once the semester starts. It doesn't necessarily mean that we wouldn't put accommodations into place throughout the semester. So, there is no firm deadline. It just helps with, I think, the organization of any new student or any student. Many times, though, we will find that something that I didn't talk about, but that can come up, is that we do also support students who have any type of sudden medical, I guess, impact. So let's just say you fell and you broke your arm. You had to have surgery of some sort. You have a sudden illness, and any of those accommodations, we can any of those diagnoses or medical conditions, we can put what we call temporary accommodations into place. Because ultimately, what we don't want is that you're managing a medical condition that's short term. But then you can't, access your academics because now you have difficulty, getting to class, you have difficulty writing, or maybe you're in a lot of pain. And so you're not going to be able to complete all your assignments on time. You would want to contact our office because we do have what we call temporary accommodations that we put in place for students for the semester or even 2 semesters, depending on how long your own recovery time is. Another best practice is to, as a student, if you are a student and you do have accommodations, it's really important to review the course syllabus of each of your classes ahead of time, so that way you understand what the class is what's going to be expected of you. And if there's anything in the syllabus that impacts your academics or that impacts your accommodations, you would want to have that conversation with your professor before the semester even begins, which is bullet number 3. When your accommodation letter gets issued out, it's always a good idea to have a meeting with your professor to go through each of the individual accommodations. The implementation of specific accommodations can vary based on class. And the reason why is that each class that you take has different learning objectives and outcomes. So one professor might manage accommodations one way, another professor might manage them a different way. There might be, something that one professor does that another doesn't do, which still all falls under the category of, approved accommodations. So it's really important to have a conversation with your professor so you understand process. A good example I can give you is testing accommodations. Many professors exclusively like to proctor or monitor all of their students taking tests, including the ones who may require extra time or require some type of test modification. Other professors may say, you know what, I don't have the time because I have to teach back-to-back classes, or maybe, they have specific accommodations that might be hard to administer. They would ask that the student take the test with Student Disability Services in our office. So that's also fine. So that, having that conversation with your professor or understanding what your professor wants, what process your professor wants you to follow is going to be important. And that's going to be different based on each class. So some classes, your professors may exclusively want you to use the testing center. Other classes, you might find that your professor can proctor the exams on their own. So each of the accommodations kind of works in that way where you want to make sure that you and your professors are on the same page. And it helps with organization and just overall process for going into the semester and having a successful semester. So I strongly encourage students to have meetings with their instructors to just do a review of their accommodation plan. Again, when you're reviewing the plan, you don't have to go into the details as to why you have accommodations. So you don't have to disclose any of the medical information or anything that relates to the medical side of your plan. The other bullet or best practice is provide advance notice to your instructors when requesting accommodations. So if there are specific accommodations that you do need to communicate with your professor on, again, maybe the testing, you do want to give them sufficient notice so that way you can work out any details. So let's just say you have a test coming up on Wednesday. You don't want to wait until Tuesday to have a conversation with your professor because that's not going to give them enough time, and they may not give our office enough time either if your professor wants you to take the test with us. So ensuring that you're having conversations with your professors in advance is going to be really important. And then I would say, you know, one thing that's really important is as a student, understanding your rights when it comes to accommodations. We do go over what your rights specifically are when you meet with us and you do an intake, but it's really important to pay attention to what that is and to ensure that you understand how to advocate for yourself as well. So we do a lot of, during our intake meeting, we review a lot of that because we want to make sure that you as a student feel empowered and you understand what, you know, how your accommodation plan works and what your rights are as a student. Questions? Okay. So best practices for our faculty and instructors. One, we would say, you know, not making any assumptions about what students' abilities or disabilities are. Again, we don't disclose out what the underlying diagnosis is, and there really is not a way for anyone to guess, I guess I would say, what a student's underlying diagnosis is, because many of the accommodations do carry over in various diagnoses. So it's really hard for a professor or anyone to know specifically. And we always encourage that, you know, you don't want to make any assumptions. As a professor, it's always a good idea to start thinking about alternative testing or what you're going to do if a student does require extra time on tests. That is one of the most popular accommodations that we have and that we approve for students. So typically students are using extra time, and it just is helpful from a process standpoint if you already have some type of plan in place, whether that's using the testing center in our office or your own office hours, or, you know, having a separate space during class time. Those are all important things just to start to consider. The other is to prepare for any unexpected flare-ups when it comes to exams and tests. A flare-up is what we call something that can unexpectedly happen to a student. A lot of times, many of our students have chronic medical conditions. So in a chronic condition, it's hard to be able to tell if, you know, you're going to be well, right? One day you might be fine, and the very next day you might be very sick. And so from a professor standpoint, it's helpful if you can, you know, think of what would you do in a situation where a student had a flare-up and maybe they had an exam or they had to make up an exam. Another one is to prepare course documents in an accessible format. This is a concept that we call, you know, it's a concept that can help all students. So accessible, what the term accessible format basically means, or PDF, is that students can use different types of technology to have that information read to them, or for them to be able to manipulate and see that information. And so that doesn't just help students a lot of times who have a diagnosis. Sometimes it just can be helpful to students because it can help with different learning modalities. So if you're a student and you're an auditory learner, if you have an accessible PDF, you could use a free screen reader and have that document read to you versus you reading it yourself. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have some type of diagnosis. It could just be helpful to you. And so we are big on supporting accessible things that are just universal that can help all students. But we do strongly encourage instructors to have accessible documents posted online. Having a syllabus, I mentioned that students should review their syllabus carefully. As from a professor standpoint, we ask that, reviewing your syllabus and ensuring everything is clearly specified. The due dates are accurate, because a lot of our students use the syllabus to help manage their academics and help manage their accommodations. So they rely on the accuracy of the syllabus, with the understanding that, you know, things happen and professors do need to make modifications and changes. But if an instructor can, as an instructor, if you can review your syllabus and try to plan ahead and try to make it as clear as possible, it can be very helpful to students. Preparing instructional support such as guided notes or multi-modality types of instruction. That's a concept of universal design. It's a best practice. It's not necessarily required. So it's not like our office would tell any individual instructor how they should operate and teach their class. We do respect the individual teachings and natures and styles of all of our professors. This is just a practice in the event that a student might need to have material presented in a different format. Again, not a requirement. None of these are requirements at all. They're just helpful to students. Providing advanced copies of slides and handouts. This is something that is very helpful to many students, whether they're registered with our office or not. A lot of times, you know, professors may have PowerPoint slides or handouts that they hand out in class. Sometimes it's beneficial to students if they are able to review that material in advance, or have it printed or have it printed, or they can download it so they can take notes. It's a helpful strategy to many of our students, especially those who might have a challenging time with note taking or the act of note taking. And then posting book lists in advance. So, which I think is helpful to all students, but understanding what books are required. Sometimes students need books in different formats, like a PDF or an audio format. So it can take time to get, you know, find those types of textbooks or those types of, so those types of textbooks. Our office does support students with digital textbooks, but again, it will take us time to be able to request a digital textbook from a publisher. So if students have advanced access to knowing what books are going to be required of them, they can start planning a little bit more in advance. Questions? Okay. The last thing I wanted to kind of leave everyone on is just a concept, I guess I would say. The concept of disability in the lens of diversity. And so I guess I would, you know, this is not something that you have to answer to you guys who are in the office, but, you know, I would want you to consider, what do you think about when you hear that? Like, what do you think about when you hear disability is diversity? And if anyone wants to share what they think about, you know, that would be awesome too. No, it's okay. The concept of disability as diversity is a newer concept, but it essentially is rooted in the idea that historically, the word disability has come in a sense, or disability services has been all focused on the medical side. So somebody has a medical condition and we're going to help them by putting an accommodation into place and, you know, ensuring that we're helping with that medical condition. And so it's the people who are disabled and then the barriers. So for example, like if you can see on one side, there's a social model, on the other side, there's the medical model. The medical model basically indicates that the person needs some kind of support. They need, and we need to, as a society, help cure them. The social model is a little bit, and this ties into diversity. The social model indicates that a person's underlying diagnosis is not necessarily a disability in a sense where we have to cure someone. It can be a part of their identity. It can intersect with any other kinds of parts of an identity. So it could be like there's your ethnic background, your gender, your socioeconomic background. So there's all of these levels of identity, and disability or diagnosis can be one of those lenses. And the social model is not to take a look at what is medically wrong with or medically impacting a student or a person and repair it. The social model indicates that why don't we put more things into place that can be accessible to everyone naturally without them having to request it through an office like ours. I'm a big believer in access and equity in the social model of disability because it provides access without any individual needing to do something specific. If everything goes as planned, our offices don't necessarily need to exist, but we exist right now because there are accommodations that we have to put in place to ensure students have access. The social model are things like, having ramps. A good example is having ramps in every building. So that's not something which right now, legally that is something that is required. I mentioned, having PDFs and accessible documents. That's not something that's necessarily required, but the social model of disability indicates that that's going to be helpful and accessible. And a student who has a diagnosis doesn't necessarily need to ask for it because it's already going to be available. So it's really the concept of the social model of disability is definitely new. One thing is for sure is that we as a university want to celebrate all of our students' different unique attributes, and having a diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean that you are disabled. It doesn't mean that you can't be successful. It doesn't also mean that you aren't proud of, whatever that diagnosis is. And so awareness around that and understanding that somebody who has a diagnosis it's a part of their identity, and those things can be celebrated and should be celebrated. And we as a community should provide the safe space to ensure that happens. And so that is one thing that our office is looking to do more of. We do provide accommodations to students, and we do all of the legal sides of things, but upcoming, one of the things that we really want to showcase more is the social side or the social model of our office, and how disability is a form of diversity and what we as a university and community can do to support each other. Questions there? I will stop sharing my screen. Can you guys see me now?
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Are there any other support groups or services on campus for students, like when they first come to school, as far as social support,
Yeah, so we have, and it's interesting because I think we have a lot of our offices are spread out. So I think student disability services is kind of like when a student comes to our office, we do recommend different services that they all, and these services or these supports are based on, they're not required of a student. So we have the Learning Center and the Writing Center for any kind of academic-based support. So we do a lot of referrals to them, especially our academic coaches. But then in our counseling office, we do have a number of support groups that directly can help students, depending on what it is that their whatever their underlying diagnosis or impacts are. But we have an autism awareness club, but we also have an autism awareness group that is run by one of our counselors. We have the Brotherhood Initiative, which is a social group as well. We have a number of different groups that the counseling office manages, and these are social. They provide support, but they also provide the opportunity for social connection. So we do talk to students if they're concerned, if students are concerned socially, we try to connect them with one of those groups, but then we also try to kind of get them connected with our student activities and student clubs and organizations. If there is something that they're specifically interested in, we will go through. We have over 100 different clubs.
You froze.
Just to approve the accommodations, but to talk about those other things too. So what is the student, what is a plan?
I don't know, but the connection is,
I don't think she can hear us when it freezes like that.
it's frozen.
Can you hear me?
You froze. Can you repeat that? I'm so sorry. You froze.
Yeah. We try to, so we do try to meet with students and we try to assess from the student, what is it that they're interested in? And then from there, we will directly try to connect them to that area. So sometimes it's a club or organization, sometimes it's a group within our counseling office, sometimes it's a job. So we will, a lot of our students, we try to get them, if we find that they are not as socially interested in socializing to that capacity, we try to push potentially an on-job or on-campus job, because that provides natural social interaction without it feeling like the student has to, that's the primary reason. And so we try to work with our career services office to see if there's good fits for different jobs on campus, and then we will connect that student with that job. For example, a good one that we recently did was a student who was on the spectrum but was really interested in technology. So we connected them with IT. And that person is thriving. They and they're also able to build a social connection. So we do try, there's not one, I guess, process we follow. We really look to have, and that's why that initial meeting with our students does typically take a full 45 minutes, if not sometimes an hour and a half. It just depends, because we do try to be as comprehensive as possible. We look at the student's schedule. We look at, how many credits they're taking. We want to make sure that the courses are manageable. We look at this, are they going to be living on campus, where they're going to be living on campus. We also look at the social, emotional piece of things. So there's a number of things that I would say we do as an office to be able to ensure that the student feels ready and feels supported. We also do ongoing just support. And I use that term a lot, but any student who's registered with our office essentially becomes what we call our student. And so we do let that student know that they should contact us if they have any concerns at all, any concerns with campus at all. It could be academic, it could be residential. We push advocacy a lot. So if there is something, that they're specifically managing, we always encourage them to have a conversation with whoever first. If they don't know, we ask them to come see us, and then we do provide them with recommendations. So sometimes we'll reach out to professors. Other times we might say, we would advise the student. A lot of times students will come to us because they are maybe about to fail a class or they're not sure what to do. We will talk to them about, we will guide them as to who their advisor is. We will, help them have a conversation with their advisor so that they can make an informed decision as to what they're going to do with that class. So we kind of become an overall support and a one-stop shop for that student, and connect them to any of the other resources on campus, because we meet with them for at least an hour. We have built that rapport, and so many times students just feel comfortable coming to us, and we want that because it helps with students feeling supported, and then we will just help them and guide them to wherever they need to go if there's any decisions that they need to make, or any conversations that they need to have. Questions, thoughts?
I have one more question. In
Sure.
the case that a student has a certain disability, and let's say you've gone through the list of accommodations, what if none of those accommodations on that list, let's say, is a good fit for the student? What are the steps your office takes after that?
So typically, I guess I would say it depends on we usually ask the student what they're requesting, right? So we'll have recommendations, but at the baseline, the student does have to request specific accommodations. Sometimes students come to our office and they're looking for something specific, but if it's not considered a reasonable request under the Americans with Disabilities Act, so we have a legal standard that we follow. If that's not a request, or if that's not something that we can reasonably put in place, we do try to discuss alternatives. A good example, is like in high school, many times students have accommodations for tutoring. Tutoring is not necessarily an accommodation that is in place when you start. So we don't have in college. So it's not an accommodation that we specifically put in an accommodation plan. And the reason why is because tutoring is available to all students. So through the Writing Center and the Learning Center, and then individually through professors. So we do have accommodations like that where they might have been specified in high school, but they're not necessarily specified in an accommodation plan in college. So we will discuss that with students as to how they can access those accommodations. Sometimes there's just modifications that a student is requesting that we just might not be able to do. An example is that if a student comes to us and says that they would like their on-ground class to now be online because they have a medical condition, we as an office cannot approve that. And the reason why we can't approve that is that the law basically states that we cannot, no accommodation can modify or drastically alter the course experience. So if you've created an on-ground class, we can't then put an accommodation in place that modifies that to the level where now the entire experience is changed for that student. And so there are certain restrictions that we have, and it's important that we kind of go through and talk to the students about. Not to say that students can't have access to certain things, but there are definitely restrictions that we want to make sure that we set in place and that students understand that accommodations don't mean that they, have a green light to everything all of the time. So there are certain policies and rules that students do have to follow in order to access those accommodations.
I have one last question. Girls and boys have about the same percentage of ADD and ADHD, but the girls, there's a big gap in diagnosing. It's like they miss the diagnosis of
Girls are
it.
usually inattentive, and boys are usually the hyperactivity.
So the boys are easy to identify. My question was, why are they missing it? What's going on?
Yeah, it is kind of what she just mentioned. So typically, I think from what I understand, it is difficult. Many times women do have ADHD, the inattentive type. So they're, which is like a lack of focus, concentration. Some of that can kind of go under the radar if a student, a student might be kind of labeled as shy. Whereas so then the professors might not, it's not something that they seemingly or teachers can recognize. Whereas hyperactivity, many times found in males, that's a little bit easier to identify. K through 12, it is tricky when it comes to like ADHD and learning disabilities because they do have to be, typically are identified during that time. And it's usually teachers that kind of have observed behaviors and then will refer the students to psychologists within that school system. So there are times when students do, fall under, I guess I would say, the radar or get diagnosed later in their life. Many times what we find that we have students, especially of different socioeconomic backgrounds, depending, they might not have had access to healthcare either. And so they might come to us and they might feel that they have specific things that impact them. We do try our best to get them referred to see if they don't have a diagnosis at all. So we work with our own health services office. We have a full operating and fully licensed counseling center. We have a medical doctor's office as well. We have a physician on staff. We have nurses, APRNs. So if a student doesn't have a diagnosis at all, we would try to get them to see some of our in-house providers first to ensure that they can get like services that way. But it is true that many times women, specifically with ADHD inattentive type, don't get diagnosed early on. And a lot of that is because I think that they just, they label them as maybe shy and quiet versus understanding that, there's something else that's impacting them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Well, thank you guys so much. I guess I would say if you ever have any students or you need anything, please, refer them to our office. Like I said, there's sometimes students who feel that they're not qualified. We don't want a student to ever feel like, one, they're not qualified, or two, that they're not going to be able to receive services. We do our very best to get them supported, again, through our own in-house network, through our office, through our counseling office, through our medical providers. We work really closely with everyone within the university to ensure that students get the services that they need. So please feel free to refer students to us, especially those who feel that they might, not qualify. That's a really important message because we will work with them.
Yeah. So, hi, so I'm sorry. I thought I could be in two places at once if I was in my other office, but it turns out anyway. But so thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to watching the recording. But there's something that I've noticed since I've been here that I just wondered if you
Sure.
could comment on. We get, as faculty members, a lot of accommodations for students being able to take exams in a quiet place with no distractions. And I think that's really important, right? But I've also had students who, once they're at college for a while, come to find out that college is really different from high school, that you don't have people getting up and wandering around and throwing things.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if that request for accommodation of like a quiet place to take the exam is a reflection on their high school experience, or if it's actually an accommodation for
Yeah, I
a
understand what you're
challenge
saying.
that they, rather than say disability, right?
Yeah, and you know what? The problem sometimes is it can be either. So usually if students indicate to us that they are very easily distracted, or they have like maybe high levels of anxiety or what, or it depends on, I guess, the underlying diagnosis, because sometimes it could be a chronic medical condition too, if they
Right.
require the use of a bathroom. What we usually do is that we always approve the student for the accommodation, but then what we have the student do is we basically say, you know, consider the classroom setting. See if you feel like that setting is going to be an appropriate setting for you. And because some professors, especially if they're going to use extended time too, some professors can accommodate them by having them come a little earlier before class starts, so then they can start early and then they can just sit with the class and finish, or they can stay late. But they're still in that classroom. Sometimes students can't handle things like, just generally somebody else writing or them watching another student take the test, because they feel like that's causing them a lot of stress and anxiety. Other students might do fine. Other students, like you mentioned, might have had a high school experience that, is distracting because people are throwing things and it's more disruptive. We do actually tell students the experience of testing in college is different. You're going to find that your classes are more regulated. Professors are, have a good handle on managing. They don't tolerate disruptive students, and, students will be asked to leave. And at that point, there's no principal's office, right? You leave and you can't come back to that class that day. So we hope that the message is a little bit different. And we find that a lot of students don't necessarily need to use the reduced distraction because of it. As a professor, though, what you can do is you can ask the student. So it's fine to ask the student and say, you have a reduced distraction testing environment as an accommodation. What does that mean to you? How would that, what impacts you and what doesn't impact you? And that's fine. They don't have to disclose the reason why they have it, but they can then give the professor information like, oh, you know what, somebody who taps their pencil, really, I can't handle that. Or somebody, I'm fine in the classroom as long as it's quiet. And so based on that information, a professor can decide what might be the best option for testing. Because when the student comes to our office to test, they don't necessarily test alone. We have a quieter space. We have cubicles, but it's not like they get a private room. And so sometimes students just the act of being in the class is impactful for them. Other times it can be something specific, or other times it could just be that they don't, it's class by class. Some classes they might be fine in the classroom, other classes that they don't. But it's always okay for a professor to ask the student how does this impact you?
Right. So another thing is, I know that students are supposed to reach out to us once the accommodation letter comes through.
Yep.
I announce it in class, not specific to anyone. It's in the syllabus. I have never had a student with an accommodation come and talk to me outside of class. They come up at the end of class and I'm like, whoa, but they're outing themselves in that way, which they're not supposed to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're not supposed to do it as faculty and staff. A student, I guess I would say, can disclose whatever they feel that they, can disclose. So if a student feels comfortable coming up to you, what you can say is like, okay, thank you, Serby, for, bringing this to my attention. Can we meet privately during office hours? So that's always fine. You don't have to, because it can be, and I don't think that sometimes the students maybe realize, how personal that conversation can get, especially because there could be multiple accommodations that they have and that professors might have a question on. And so it might be more than just a 2-minute conversation. And I think sometimes students don't realize that. We indicate, and we put it in writing, students should reach out to their professors to schedule a meeting. Not, after class, like they should have a meeting either through Teams or in person so that they can actually go through and talk about the accommodations. And that usually that doesn't generally take more than a few minutes, but it's important for there to be some privacy so that you as a professor also feel comfortable asking them any questions that you might want to ask them. But
Thank
it's always
you.
okay if the student does out themselves. That's that's the student, so they can. It's just we can divert that conversation to later, so you don't have to feel forced to have that conversation with that student in front of all the other students.
Thank you.
No problem. Yes, I would say, and one thing, depending on who's going to watch this, one thing for sure is for faculty, anytime any instructor has any questions regarding an accommodation plan, you can always reach out to me and always have that conversation, because sometimes the accommodations themselves can be confusing. There are restrictions, limitations, and guidelines around these accommodations. So I think that, we want to ensure that our instructors feel just as supported as our students do. And our role as an office is to do that. And it's to make sure that professors feel as if they also have the tools that they need in order to have a successful semester for their students.
Thank you.
So thank you guys for your time. I appreciate it. If you have any questions or anyone needs anything, please feel free to reach out to me.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
for
Thank
joining.
you. You're welcome.
I just wanted to say that
Too late.
they should join us for next time. Is it still recording?
Yeah, still recording.
It's still recording. So please join us for the Circle of Care presentation by Emily Marie. She's a graduate intern in the Office of the Vice President for Student Affairs on September 26th. And Talking Tuesday, tomorrow, our guest will be Adriana Rodriguez. She's the Executive Director of Spanish Community of Wallingford, and that's tomorrow at 12:15. Please join us.
Nice job, y'all.
Thank you.
I miss you. Was